This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. She's a leading tech executive, entrepreneur, VC, investor, 25 plus years of experience. She's had a chance to work with some of the biggest names around, from Google to Amazon. Most recently, she served as president of StubHub, the ticket broker. To put it mildly, she's seen a lot. She's met a lot of interesting people, and she's got a great deal of experience in a world where I think a lot of people want to know more. Look, life is about decision-making. It's about risk-taking. It's about choices. And I love how Sukhinder breaks this down in a way that we could all learn. For example, you make a choice. You make a decision. It goes badly. What do? Cry in your milk? Or do you take the lesson, learn something from it, and move on? This is just one of those great stories. One of those great stories that will remind you that you've got to do it. There is nobody coming to your rescue. It's you. And Sukhinder gives her experience, the path that she's been down, in a way where, damn it, if you can't take something from that, learn from her, and apply it to your life, you're gone, retire, give up. Come on, you know that's how I'm going to say it. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Without any further delay from me, let's jump right into my conversation with Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. I hope you enjoy. In my world, before I started this podcast and before I started talking to all kinds of interesting people like you, I wrote a bunch of trading books, and the trading books were a trading strategy and essentially very much a venture capital strategy. The premise being, we don't know where the big trend is going to come from. So we need to take a lot of small bites at a lot of things, and we can't pine for what the big winner is going to be because we can't predict the dang thing. So we just have to take a lot of small bites, protect our downside, and hope for the best. Sound like you?
Well, not only does it sound like me, I would say that's a lot of the principle of the book. But why don't people take that same attitude towards their careers? Yes, it does sound like me. And I think this is the same thing as you. And there's something in the book about trading philosophy and how it's similar. It doesn't mean that you're reckless or rash in your risk taking. When you're a trader, you're actually very deliberate. I mean, you build a portfolio, you're very calculated, but yes, you prepare that you can be wrong as much as you can be right. And you go into portfolio theory believing that. That is a lot of how I approach the world. You're right. I think I take a lot of bites at the apple. And I believe fundamentally that people need to think about risk taking and taking bites at the apple as a calculated and achievable process, as opposed to something that's only for the riskiest among us. Like if you say to somebody you're a trader, their first instinct might be that you're very much of the risk-taking gene. But if you actually broke down trading, you'd find it's fairly quantitative and calculated in its risk-taking approach to building a portfolio.
I think we should probably start with the word. It's a word near and dear to me, but I want to hear about your view of it, even though we probably will have very similar thoughts about it. The word risk, because this is a word that I don't think in this day and age, a lot of young kids, smart kids, okay, they're told, memorize everything, get the great grades, go to an Ivy, and then when you get out, somebody's going to give you the dream job. But where does this word risk fit into their world? It's an interesting word. How do you define it?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, if you think about, and I think this is where the problem starts, if you think about the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of risk, number one, the first definition is the possibility of loss or injury. The second definition for it in the dictionary is someone or something that creates or suggests a hazard. So what about that trains younger people or people anywhere in their careers to think about risk-taking as a positive thing? And so I look at the origin of the word risk, and it's no surprise that people are more apt to think about the downside of a choice rather than the upside, or more importantly, to obsess about the focus on the downside. And more importantly, even than focusing on the downside, is they presume that every choice is binary. It's like one risk equals a mighty reward or an abject failure, as opposed to thinking about risk taking as a process that unlocks reward.
On a continuum, they want to see it like a lottery ticket. It's not a lottery ticket.
It isn't a lottery ticket. Isn't that the irony? Most people want to view risk as a single event, and they gear themselves up to make a mighty choice. And they do look at it as a lottery ticket. And they look at folks from afar and think, gosh, they won the lottery. And mostly I say, no, they practiced a lot of risk taking. You started with this topic. They took a lot of little risks. They took them in calculated fashion. Some worked out, some didn't, but they're always ready to choose again. And they choose in a calculated way while being prepared and flexible for whatever the outcome is and being ready to respond. I don't really think anything about the way kids go to school teaches them that. In fact, I was trying to find a good example of where people learn to take calculated risks as young people. And the only thing I could really come up with is when they apply to schools. All of a sudden, somebody teaches them portfolio theory. It's like, hey, if you want to go to a school that you dream of, apply. But at the same time, apply to 50 other schools, apply to your safety schools, apply to your dream school, apply in one program, apply in another program. That's about the first time that kids really encounter any notion of risk taking for upside and risk taking as a strategy as opposed to a hope and a prayer. But up until that point, it's all linear. It's all, hey, do this test, win this mighty feat, ace it, and on to the next thing you want to conquer. So I think I've been taught that the world is very binary and there's one choice that's the right choice. And I don't really think they think about risk as a strategy, as we talked about.
Let me dive back in time, a little bit of an origin story. You grew up in a country I've never been to yet. Even though I'm not that far away, I'm probably closer to Tanzania than you are today. Speak to me about your upbringing. I think there's something that we have in common. My father had a dental orthodontic practice. He's still 45 plus years. But watching him as an entrepreneur really affected me because I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, so most people working for the government. So I felt lucky to be watching somebody up close and personal who was doing his entrepreneurial thing. Even if the doctor side of it was not for me, the entrepreneurial side was. I think you had something very common in your upbringing.
Absolutely. You're right. To harken back to your origin story, I was born in Tanzania. I'm Sikh by background, and my parents ran a joint medical practice there. And then they had to leave Tanzania and relatively speaking quickly. I think they left most of their possessions behind, but they were worried about the political instability in Tanzania and had long wanted to move to Canada to give us a better education. So they took one mighty move, and in their I think my dad was in his 40s when he moved. He restarted his practice in Canada alongside my mom. They restarted their careers as doctors once they immigrated. But to your point, my dad loved being an entrepreneur as much as he loved being a doctor. He loved running a small business. He loved working for himself. I always tell the story that he had us doing his ledgers manually, logging his checks and expenses. Probably when I was 7 or 8, I started doing that. Tax time in our house was the time where everybody had to pile on and help my dad do a year's worth of receipts inside of a month in order to file his tax returns. But I saw that entrepreneurship was the opposite of something that was inaccessible and only for the wealthiest corporate strategists. It was something as small as building a medical practice, bit by bit, patient by patient, line item by line item. And it was both creative and incredibly grinding. Both were true. And I saw it up close. And certainly it sounds like your dad did the same for you. My dad loved running a business, and he really instilled in me in this belief that both in makership and possibility, but also in this idea of working for myself. And all those things, I'm sure, have influenced my views of the world.
Did you ever have a moment in time growing up with that entrepreneurial up close and personal experience? Did you ever have a point in time when you started to get into school and you were around peers that perhaps did not have the entrepreneurial exposure, where they influenced you in a way to where you got older in life and you looked back, you're like, dang, all those entrepreneurial lessons early on, those stayed true my whole life?
I don't know if you traveled the same road, but I went to undergraduate business school. And to be clear, I went through this period where I craved the opposite. I was in an undergraduate business school called Ivy School in Canada. It's equivalent to, let's call it Wharton's undergrad program or UVA's, all case study. And everybody I knew wanted to be an investment banker or a consultant or go work for Kraft or P&G. I had a lot of copycat syndrome. And once I graduated from school, I wanted to be an investment banker too. So I think there was a period in there where I sort of rejected entrepreneurship and fell in love with this idea of being like some corporate executive, whatever that meant. And then I went on to Merrill Lynch, and then I went on to be Sky B, and both were really fun experiences. By the time I was 26 or so, I was like, I really think I do want to start a business. And I started to remember all of those lessons my dad taught me. So pretty early on, I would say I moved away from it, and then I slingshotted back by my mid or late 20s to wanting to do something entrepreneurial.
Your mid to late 20s would have put you within close proximity to Netscape going public in 1995.
You got it. And I think therein my one lucky stroke, I moved to Silicon Valley in 1997. To your point, Google was just getting started. I mean, Amazon, I think, had gone public maybe 1996 or 97. Netscape was the IPO darling. That was the era in which I moved here. And unbeknownst to me, it was a pretty good time to catch a large tailwind called the internet.
It really felt like, I still remember, I can't say I remember the exact feeling, but when Netscape went public in 1995, I was like, well, this is game on. This is going to change everything. And I kept thinking to myself, okay, this is going to be the end of office buildings. And I was living in Northern Virginia near Dulles Airport. And all of a sudden they built more for the next 15 years. All of my friends and whatnot, they just were taking jobs. They weren't looking at the internet as this fundamental opportunity for them to just use it to go create magic. That feeling stuck with me and influenced me to this day.
Yeah. And I think for me, it taught me one of my first and most important lessons in risk taking, which is people often think that when we take a risk, it's all about us. It's all about us and our efforts and how mighty we are and how great we are. And if we fail, what terrible people we are. It's all so personal. When in fact, a lot of successful risk takers and calculated risk takers look for the headwinds and tailwinds of any situation. And I tell you, I certainly could not have predicted the size of this tailwind or the enormity of it. But I think just wanting to move to where people were doing interesting things and starting businesses is what led me to move to Silicon Valley. The importance of tailwinds is a really, really big thing when you're making choices about what you might want to do with your life or career and trying to figure out how to unlock faster success. I think we underestimate the influence of the world around us, and we tend to overestimate how everything rides on our ability to execute. Of course, we need to execute, but life's not entirely in our control.
I've got your fine book here with me. When did you, I mean, obviously this is a work in progress that goes back many decades. These ideas and concepts you've been thinking about for a long time, they just didn't spring out in the last 2 months. When do you think you were fully formed on this notion of risk taking and I'm going to have losses and don't let the emotions go crazy? Just keep riding, keep taking the baby steps. Some are not going to work out. What age do you think you fully understood that you were going to be using this mindset for your career?
I had the idea for this book probably 7 or 8 years ago. And so I would say that's when it was maybe more fully formed. Call it 2014, maybe 2013 to 2015 is when I first started contemplating writing this book. And in fact, I think I reached out to an agent even back then. But I think the reason it was fully formed by then is because I'd lived multiple cycles myself in my career. People often tell you, like, I don't know if you've ever heard this, when you're early in your career, like your gut may not be operating because you just don't have that much pattern matching or experience to create a framework for yourself. I would say it's once I'd lived 3 or 4 cycles of my own career. I'd been in, obviously, as we talked about, in investment banking and larger corporate person early in my career. And then I came to Silicon Valley and ended up being an entrepreneur. And then I went to Google and lived fast growth to massive scale. And then I went back to being an entrepreneur at Polyvore and at Joyous. And then in between, I became an investor and a board member. So I think I'd lived multiple cycles. And I don't know about you, but the way I make sense of my own world is I like to put things in frameworks. It became clear to me that there were some patterns going on in my own career, but I wouldn't say it was fully formed until I'd lived 3 or 4 of those cycles. And interestingly, ironically, I would say in the last 7 years since I first had this idea, I've lived a couple more cycles. And guess what? They look remarkably the same or similar to the cycles I endured earlier in my career. They just like their patterns that keep repeating, which is why I guess I really wanted to write the book. I think that even though risk is a mystery to most people, there are patterns that we can talk about that help you become a smarter risk taker while appreciating that any single choice may not work out the way you want.
Given your age, given the time frame at which you showed up in Silicon Valley, you had a chance to meet a tremendous number of interesting people that we will not have a chance to talk about every last one on this conversation because it could go on for a long time. It's just one of the unique opportunities to be at that point in time that you've got the chance to experience. You don't necessarily have to even give me a name, but share with me perhaps in your late 20s, your 30s, the experience where a particular individual that might have shared with you an experience, something that shaped you, where you really had that aha moment long before you sat down to write this book, but really set perhaps this book in motion 15 years ago or 20 years ago?
Why don't I give you an example of somebody I met who to this day I consider a mentor and somebody I always look to for advice and counsel, but who struck me maybe the moment I met them in ways you might not appreciate because you probably don't know this person. This is a gentleman named Venki Harinarayan. I'm not sure if you've ever heard Venki's name. Right now, he's a venture capitalist. He runs his own fund. This is the second time over he's run a fund. But when I met him, he was the founder of a company called Junglee. And Junglee was an early e-commerce pioneer. I joined his company as to be a product manager, though I pivoted into being a biz dev person pretty quickly. And ultimately, as an early pioneer in comparison shopping, he and his 4 co-founders sold his company to Amazon for $200 million odd in 1999, and I was part of that acquisition. And Venki's gone on to start many more companies. Some of them you might know. Efficient Frontier is a good example. Another one is Cosmix that became Walmart Labs, several more entrepreneurial successes. And then, as I said, he's run and he continues to run a fund today. So what was so magical or interesting about Venki, and why was he so impressive and important to me? Well, let me just juxtapose it with what was going on for me the moment before I met Venki. I'd come to Silicon Valley and I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I'd been about 4 or 5 years in business. We talked about the fact that I actually wanted to go into investment banking, and I did. I went to work for Merrill Lynch, and then I went to work for B Sky B, which is a media company that was a subsidiary of News Corp. And I had really good experiences. I got given lots of responsibility. It was really fun. It was fast-paced. These were aggressive environments. And even though they were male-dominated, I totally fit. I don't know any other way to describe it. They just let me run and I thrived. And I got to the Valley, and in my first experience on the job with the startup I won't name, my boss told me on the second day that I was scaring the secretaries. This was a job I really wanted. It was an interactive TV startup. It seemed really glamorous. It was my first job in the Valley. I thought quite well of myself for having landed the job, taking the risk to move here and landed this job. And within 6 months, I was miserable. I just kept feeling like my boss and I didn't have common values. I just felt like he treated me differently.
Why were you scaring the secretaries?
That's the point. You tell me. I didn't know. On day 2, to be given that message.
You still know?
No, well, let's put it this way. I know I'm aggressive, but I don't know that I believe that the right message to give a young girl at her second day at the job is that somehow she is so aggressive as to not fit. Set the tone for not a great job experience, where I kept feeling like I was getting less and less responsibility. You
were not a secretary by any stretch of the imagination. So what was that reference? Seems very unusual.
I think it was something about the way I held myself. Maybe it was the way I walked into the bathroom. I have no idea. But what I do know is the signal I got on day 2 of a new job was that I was not a fit, that I was appearing overly aggressive. And I wasn't really used to getting those signals. I was used to going places where I was well received. Anyway, let's carry this story forward. So I'm not having a really good job experience in my first job. And in fact, I'm starting to think like maybe I'm not cut out for Silicon Valley. I moved here, don't seem to be getting the same amounts of responsibility that I'm used to in my previous jobs. My boss and I don't really seem to be eye to eye in terms of what I think I'm capable of and what he does. And I'm getting these mixed messages about whether I'm too aggressive. Luckily for me, I take a call from a technical recruiter who tells me that he wants me to go interview for a company called Junglee, whose tagline is, no joke, the internet is the database. I'm not sure if you know what that means. I certainly didn't, but I was like, But he told me about these very 4 impressive PhDs from Stanford, group of Indian PhDs who were starting this company. And he asked me to go in an interview. And so I walk in to an interview with 2 people, but the person who struck me most was Venki. Venki was the co-founder of Junglee, and he was probably just maybe a couple years older than me. And he was the smartest, most straightforward, and just like down-to-earth human I'd ever met in the Valley. Of course, not ever met, but in the Valley. And when I interviewed with him, my first thoughts were, okay, I'm not sure I'm really excited about what the company's technology does. It's the little spiders that go out and scrape different websites to get job listings. But I really am impressed with you. You're super sharp. You keep me on my toes in this interview. You're totally humble, totally. The most understated, I don't know, just no bullshit person you could meet. And you're super candorous. Within 30 minutes of that interview, I thought, I know nothing about this company, but I want to work for you. I think I can learn a lot. I love that you just seem to sort of put it all out there. And I love how humble and just how you show up in the world.
You went for the who.
You got it. I went for the who, not for the what. And the who of Venki were things we shared in common, maybe from a values perspective. I loved how transparent and candorous he was. He could teach me things. He had a completely different style to me. He wasn't as aggressive or extrovert or what have you. He was just so impressive and so smart. And I just felt like I could learn a lot from him, and he would create an environment that I wanted to be in. So, of course, that seminal lesson stayed with me, and you can read about it in the book. But Venki stayed with me. So while Venki was my boss at Junglee, and we ultimately sold that company to Amazon, he went on to take many more risks. And I stayed close to him throughout my career. He became an investor in my own startups. But at a later point in my career, when I was in crisis, it was my first CEO job, and I was at odds with the founder, and the board really needed to pick which of us was going to run the company. It was 15 years after this, after I first met him. Venki was the person I called. He was the person I called when I was in crisis. And I was like, Venki, what do I do? Do I stay? Do I go? Do I fight for this company? Do I not? And as always, he had that understated, level-headed combination of perspective that was both smart and insightful, but also calming. And so throughout my career, I've gone back to Venki again and again when I have career choices to make. He's somebody I trust to this day. I hope he would say the same about me, immeasurably, both for his intellect, but also for how he just carries himself through the world. That's an example of somebody who made a mark on me and the type of people I want to work for, the type of leader I'd hope to become one day, and what I value in the people around me and what I look for. He really was a seminal influence on me.
You brought up a phrase in that answer, and I jotted it down. I imagine there are some women who might expand on it a lot, but the way that you are talking, the way that you sound like you have approached your career, I have a feeling you might have approached things differently. But you use the phrase male-dominated culture or male-dominated. But you seem like the type of person, in listening to you, that you really don't have a lot of time to sit around and have long sociological debates. You just seem like a kind of person who just, if there was an obstacle, you just went around it.
Well, both are true. I am somebody who, as you can probably tell, I'm built to be intense. If you haven't figured that out in our phone call, I could give you a dozen more examples, or our podcast. So let's put it this way. I've been wired as an aggressive, intense person my whole life. And luckily, I've moved into environments where I thrive. And some people call those, by the way, male-dominated cultures. Some people call them more aggressive cultures. All I know is that I have moved into environments where that aggressiveness and intensity was largely seen as a strength and appreciated. So on the one hand, you can say, I've moved through obstacles. I mean, I would just say I'm built and hardwired to be intense. On the other hand, and I think this is really important, I would say only in the last 10 years of my career did I stop and really put pencil to paper in thinking about what are the obstacles that have been created for myself as a woman or for others who are women or people of color. And I think I only really lifted my head up to consider the inequities of the system in which we live in the last 5 to 6 years. And why is that? Because as you said, when you're used to just driving through obstacles and being an entrepreneur, and by the way, being an entrepreneur tells you like every day there are new obstacles, and they may have nothing to do with your gender or the color of your skin. It's just really hard. You're wired to drive, and I'm wired to drive as an entrepreneur and just by personality type. But that doesn't mean that you can ignore the obstacles or the lack of possibility that some groups face versus others. I don't even think that I acknowledged the underlying influence that first conversation with that first boss had on me until I was probably 20 years into my career and watching women and people of color around me be denied opportunity and sort of starting to think like, what is that all about? And I think I only became sensitive to it when I became an entrepreneur again after Google and started watching the experiences of women and people of color around me and fundraising and other ways in which the playing field was not level. So I want to say both things are true. Yes, I am built and wired to drive, and I love being in environments where I can do that. On the other hand, if we think and want to kid ourselves that possibility and opportunity is equivalent for all folks, it isn't. And I think we have to be mindful of the ways in which our language, all of our languages, myself included, our biases, our own prejudices, really actually do create more obstacles for some versus others. So both can be true. And I think that's the duality in which I live today. Both can be true. It can be true that you can drive through obstacles.
The way you outline it is interesting because until we get life extension, we've all got limited time. I would probably argue that the way that you have done it, which is, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but kind of bull in a china closet, you're just going to do it. You're going to ram through whatever you got to get through, and you're going to get around the obstacles, which is a guy sort of view in a way, or at least the way guys are raised to think. But that perspective that you have in a limited time life that we all have, and I think that's a lot what you do in your book, but that kind of perspective is probably going to get people farther than perhaps a lot of the debates and the arguments that are so common in society today. I just think your way of let's do it, let's go, boom, boom, boom. In hindsight, it sure looks like winner, winner, chicken dinner philosophy.
Maybe, but I would say one thing is really important, and I think it's important to me at this stage. So yes, I'm a driver, but we can agree that drivers come in different packages. I know introverts who are drivers. I know extroverts who are drivers. I know women who are drivers. I know men who are drivers. I know people of color who are drivers. I know people who are 65 or 25. You can be a driver and come in any sort of different packages. I think where things get risky is when we assume that a driver comes in only one package. So I happen to look and fit a package that maybe people are comfortable with because I'm super aggressive. And in other ways, I don't look like the archetypical package because I'm a woman and a person of color. I just think we need to all be mindful. Excellence comes in all shapes and packages, and the world opens up to us when we kind of expand our perspective on what's possible from whom.
Let me take this to kind of another big picture philosophy type thought process, and really gets at the heart of being an entrepreneur too. The notions of freedom and autonomy. There's something about having the ability to find a way to bring that dollar in, that payment in, the way that somebody pays for their food, their rent. But when one has that feeling that I did it, that I brought something in, there is a huge psychological benefit going on there, contrasted against perhaps many people, and this is a little bit of a caricature, but many people that take the job and they never really get a chance to have that entrepreneurial feeling. The entrepreneurial feeling, when you experience it, if one has never experienced it, you almost can't go back once you bite that apple.
Well, I think you're talking about a mindset. When you're an entrepreneur, you learn it in spades, but I would call that mindset agency. So many people fear agency because with agency comes accountability. If I do it and it doesn't work out, everyone's going to look to me and say, what the hell happened? But the upside of agency is not just believing you can act, but it's also in believing that you can respond to the results of any action. And so you're right. When you live the entrepreneur's life, you do realize a bunch of things that are inherent to actually risk taking, whether or not you're an entrepreneur or you're in a corporate career. There are things that are in your control and things that are not in your control. And what you do have always is the opportunity to choose. I do think that being an entrepreneur, you learn agency and you learn to be comfortable with some level of accountability, like you live and die by your results. But that doesn't mean that there's only one bite at the apple. As an entrepreneur, there are 10 bites at the apple or 100, and you're always pivoting to find that next opportunity. And as you said, remarkably, that's fairly empowering, whether you fail or whether you succeed. That's the mindset I wish that we could encourage people or persuade people to take into any situation, even if you're in a larger company. The feeling of agency, it's irreplaceable. And quite frankly, when you have agency, whether you fail or succeed, you still feel some level of power.
Somebody takes the risk. You take the risk. Anyone takes the risk. And there's a big loss. On paper, to the person who has not yet tried it, on paper, that big loss is so scary. However, if one happens to be living it and you get the big loss, I'm not saying it feels any better, but that big loss is one heck of a teacher, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's not just the big loss. I think the other thing besides the big loss that's one heck of a teacher is that however you recover, you recover. I always say to people, there's a choice after the choice that you make once you've experienced loss. What's a good example? I think in the book, I talk about the fact that I learned when I was an investment banker that I wanted to start to make money on things I knew. Because I worked in the financial services industry, I started buying small amounts of stock in that industry, and I succeeded. I started making some money. And then when I was at Jungly, which sold to Amazon, I got a whole wad of Amazon stock. And in the middle of the dot-com boom, I did the exact opposite. I turned that stock over to a broker who told me all to put it in a stock in a category I didn't know, and I listened. And I lost virtually all of the money I made at Amazon.
Brokers are so bad. Brokers, I don't want to say too much too bad, but I mean, there's not much I can say good.
But my point is, after that choice and that epic fail financially, I still went on and had to choose again where to put the money I'd earned. And you're right, it was a very painful lesson. But once I recovered from that lesson, there's nothing like recovery from failure to teach you, honestly, how to endure more failure and take more risk. It's ironic that some of the best risk takers are people who've obviously endured far more failure than people who never take any risk.
I was somebody who played American baseball into college, and baseball teaches you, you're going to go up there and you're going to swing, and 7 out of 10 times, you're not going to do anything productive. And that's success.
And that's success. The 300 batting average is amazing, and 400 puts you in the Hall of Fame, I'm sure.
Look, I know that's what you're doing with your work here, but it's like, how do you get this more to people? When I watch society as a whole, and I'm in a very entrepreneurial culture right now. I mean, look, there is really no safety net in Vietnam. So the number one word in a place like Vietnam is hustle. You hustle, you make it happen. And if you talk to a young person in Vietnam, a country, 50 million people under the age of 35, all they want to do is start a business. It doesn't make a difference. They all want to start a business. I sometimes think that maybe, and look, you're going to have some bias being in Silicon Valley, but maybe we've lost a little bit of that in America, where people have that desire to go take a chance and make something happen.
You asked a key question like, okay, so how do you get people to take more risk? Well, I think part of the way you get people to take more risk is you give them the practical tactics. You don't tell them to wish on a hope and a prayer. You don't say, gosh, take a risk. Just go ahead. I think you have to give people tools and frameworks, and you have to show them that there's a method to the madness. And that is the only reason I stopped to write this book, because if I thought that all I had to say was take a risk, I'd be like, yeah, that's somewhat useful, but how useful is it? But if you said, hey, there's a way to get going, there's a way to get smarter, and there's even patterns to how rewards unfold around risk taking, I want to give you the tools to be able to take more risks and to challenge your assumption that you need to be a mighty risk taker going in. I bet you, if you embrace it as a muscle, you can become a risk taker coming out. I guess my philosophy on all this stuff is you have to give people practical tools.
I mean, a lot of this is philosophy and mindset, but what's the most practical tool from your perspective?
I think the most practical tool from my perspective that you give people, I'd say number one, I think there are tactics around what I call managing your fear of failure to get you into action. To me, that's like the most tactical set of tools you can give people. I say to people, when you choose to take risk, you're looking at a fear equation and a risk-taking equation that looks something like this. You have FOMO, your fear of missing out on something really positive. You have fear of failure. And if your FOMO is greater than your fear of failure, you'll act. And if your fear of failure is greater than your FOMO, you'll stay inactive. So if we said the primary goal of risk taking is to get people to make one choice, whatever the minimum viable choice is that gets them moving towards the thing that they want, then I would say one of the things you can do most for people is say, okay, here are the tactics to reduce your fear of failure. Because in that risk-taking equation, you can pump your FOMO all you want, but if your fear of failure remains higher than your FOMO, you just won't act. So I say to people in that regard, I say, look, name your fears. And I always think fears sit in 3 areas. Fears that come from our ego, fears of financial risk, and then really fears around personal happiness. So like name your risks. Number 2, size your risks. So I think people have no idea how to size their risk. Their presumption is that every risk is of equal size. And it's only when you say to people, okay, I want you to take a look at a choice you want to make, go to the other side of that choice and imagine that it fails. Imagine that now. I want you to tell me, how many choices do you have to make after the choice? Is that choice you're going to make going to take you through what Jeff Bezos would call a one-way door, where there's no going back? In fact, most choices we make are a two-way door, where there's the option to retreat, there's the option to make 5 more choices. So when you help people to size their risks, what they can really do is think about how to really imagine failure and plan for failure, probably even more than success. Weirdly, that helps get people into action because they start to imagine what we talked about before, that choice after the choice. They start to imagine what they would do if things failed. And funnily enough, when we start to do that and realize how many choices we have that are still available to us after we make our first move, it eases people's fear of failure in that every outcome is binary and dependent on a single choice. When I think about the most useful tactics for people, I think they're all around tactics to manage our fear of failure, not by avoiding it, but by facing it. And facing it in order to get into action, not to avoid acting.
You mentioned the word aggressive earlier in describing yourself. I think you did. What about being aggressive makes you feel good?
Are you going to ask me next what makes me feel bad? I can see that question coming. Look, I think what about being aggressive makes me feel good? Well, first of all, I'm not sure I have any choice. I think I was wired
No, you have a
wired
choice.
this
That's the
way.
whole point of the conversation.
Oh, no, of course. But I'm just saying, like, my aggressive style, like my personality, that part of how I'm
I
wired.
want to know why. You didn't get wired just magically. You weren't just born that way. Something, I mean, I actually get it. I kind of relate to it big time. And I think I probably have turned some people off being so aggressive, but I just have to do it. It feels almost like a search for the truth.
You're hitting it. Okay. So if you want to get philosophical, you
Yep.
just hit it when you said that. You said, why are you so aggressive? Okay. Let's presume that this was all nurture, not nature for a moment. Let's just say there was none of me wired that way the day I was born. I would say that I was raised in a family that believes that your vocation, what you do in your life and who you are can be infused and you're here to have an impact. Like at the most spiritual level, my parents taught me that we are all here to have an impact. So since the day I was born and the way I was raised, I've always been on this journey to make sure that if I'm here for a limited period of time, I maximize that time to have the most impact I can, that I am purposeful and that I exercise my purpose. So if you ask me why am I aggressive, because I always feel like I'm running against some clock that's internal. Do you know what I mean? Which is, well, if I could do it today and my time is limited, why wouldn't I do it today? Like every day is a day lost. And I think that some of my aggressiveness certainly comes from this idea that every day is a day lost in a lifetime where we're all here to have some kind of impact. Like I believe I'm here for a purpose.
Where do you think your parents got it from? Culture or their grandparents, their parents?
You hit on a couple things. Number one, I'm sure part of where my parents got that hustle is sort of that immigrant hustle. They came from first generation families that had nothing. My mother's father, and this is maybe going back too far, but he was a World War I veteran who was disabled. He had no money. He used his pension to figure out a way to put his youngest daughter, my mother, through medical school. And her brother helped pay for her medical school. My father, his dad, migrated to Uganda, became a policeman in Uganda. My dad had to raise all 7 of his brothers and sisters, and he became a doctor and then supported everybody else financially so they could also get an education. I'm sure part of where my own parents got it is having not had much, maximizing the most of what they had and coming from families where your job is to maximize your opportunity when opportunity is scarce. I think that's part of it. And I think the other place my parents got it is religion. I grew up with highly spiritual parents who really ultimately believed we're all here for a higher purpose. I think that's the combination. Immigrant hustle plus higher purpose.
This is hard. And maybe this is one of the reasons I love being in Saigon. This is hard to get across to the typical American suburbanite young person who has parents who has given them a big safety net. And this is a difficult thing to get across because, you know, it's like, oh, let me go play the video game or whatever. Whereas clearly you are a person who is turned on and you're ready to go. And those people don't realize they're competing against you. It's true. Look, I was talking to someone recently. That was a very American-centric conversation. I was like, hold on, you know where I am. I said, if I want to hire a young person right now, I'm going to the Philippines. They got great English and they're cheaper and they work harder. And it was like stunned silence. I can't believe you're saying that about Americans. I'm like, oh my God, come on. It's a global world.
Well, I think you're hitting on the fear every parent has, myself included, which is, I know you're talking about me as a competitor, but think about me as a parent for a moment, which is once you come away from that immigrant mentality and hustle, how do you how do we all train our children to take risk and hustle? Because I have 3 in a world where we're also striving to give them safety and comfort. Of course, you know, the irony of all this is think about how much safer it is to take a risk when you have a safety net versus when you don't. I mean, there's an irony in that whole thing. I think there are 2 things that are true. First of all, unlike you, I don't believe it's a zero-sum game. I believe I can win and you can win. So I don't think it's me against the world or me against somebody else. I think there's abundant opportunity. I think it's about how you grasp it. And I think our real challenge, as you pointed out, is not to teach people who have a lack of possibility to strive for possibility. It's how to encourage people to take risk when they could do nothing, when they could just do nothing.
A lot of people probably wake up in their 50s after doing nothing and go, oh, shoot, I didn't listen. Damn it. I should have been a little more aggressive in my 20s.
Well, hopefully most of the world wakes up. I'll tell you something that may not resonate with you. I think most of the world wakes up wanting to strive. I personally believe that most people want to strive. It's the how of striving that scares people. I don't think most people wake up and say, hey, I don't want to be successful. I don't want to be purposeful. I don't want to have impact. I think where most people get stuck is not the want, it's the how. That's my personal belief. What I was going to say is in writing this book, I wanted to sort of just create some little fun tools that people could use to get themselves thinking about their own risk-taking style. So we created this quiz that's on the site, that's on the book site. And we created these 4 archetypes for risk takers. And then we put that little quiz out to a sample of the US population before I wrote it. By the way, I'm not a scientist. So like caveat the whole thing by saying.
You understand the scientific method as much as anybody. We're all scientists.
Yeah. So we created this quiz and we put it out to a sample of the US population. And of these 4 archetypes, what we found is that 60% of the population we sampled, even before it's now on LinkedIn, you can take it, and you can take it, as I said, online. We found that 60% of the people fit the archetype we call contemplators. That archetype is they're strivers, but they're so busy filling out the pros and cons list of any situation, which they can do thoughtfully. Everybody's a planner. As I said, everybody wants to strive. But where they get stuck is that making a decision seems so momentous that they get stuck in action. And so the contemplator, it's not that they don't want more or they don't have the same level of ambition. It's not that they can't create a great pros and cons list. It's just when it comes to action, deciding seems so scary. And again, the book was really written to help people decide and make choices and get off of this notion that you should be overweighting a single choice. You shouldn't. You should make the first choice. But really, all the power is in the fact that you get to keep choosing. No story is done until you've probably made 100 choices. The reward's not coming on the first choice. You have to make 99 more. And so therein is the thing that should keep you from being scared of making the first move. Therein should be the power. I believe most of the world moves around contemplators.
As you talk about choice, it got me thinking about coaches and whatnot. I'm kind of a yoga nut, and I think about doing handstands for the first time. And if somebody looks at someone doing a handstand, they can say to themselves, oh my gosh, if I fall down, that's going to hurt. That's true. But one way around it is if you put yourself in the room and then everyone else is doing it, and you literally have to walk out the door, slink out the door, and not do it. It's almost like if we could get to the point where people don't have so much choice. I mean, I think so much choice sometimes gives people a chance to run away, where if we could take a lot of what you're saying and force it on people. I mean,
can you make the minimum viable choice? Let's say you have a dozen choices. If a dozen choices is daunting, just pick the smallest move you can make in one direction to get more data. And then relieve yourself of making the big choice, make the little choice and go. Because you're right. I mean, people are daunted by too many choices, and that in itself creates uncertainty, which is, again, ironic. But I think our job is to help people become smarter and more calculated risk takers, which is, okay, take all the choices, analyze them. I'm going to put a framework around them for you to help you think about which ones have a better chance of being successful. Your job is to make the minimum viable choice in one direction and start getting some data before you choose again. People overwhelm themselves with choice, just like they overwhelm themselves with planning. I don't know how much planning you've seen in your lifetime as a CEO. Oh my God, I've seen plans that have so much detail, yet they keep people from getting into action. And mostly I'm like, can you give me your rough plan and your thesis? And let's get moving. And then you can come back and tell me your plan as it evolves.
As we wind down, one last thought, big picture, and we've touched on this a little bit, but instead of people, and I want you to elaborate here, instead of people always thinking about the magical, what could go right, this lottery ticket mindset, if you just focus on protecting the downside and think about it in terms of Vegas. I like Vegas, but I don't like playing any games at Vegas. But if one just thinks about it and says, well, if they do like games at Vegas, if you don't have any money, you can't play. You've got to keep chips in your pocket. This is, I think, part of the hard mindset. How do you get people to worry more about the downside? And if you worry about the downside and you believe in the possibility of, as you say, to choose the possibility, if you believe in the possibility of life and you protect your downside, the upside is going to surprise you generally over the course of a lifetime in very positive ways.
Amen to that. That is exactly as we talked about what I believe. If you go all the way back and say, okay, how do you make this actionable? I would say to everybody, who's listening to this podcast or otherwise, okay, presume that in any choice you have two fears at war. One is the fear of missing out. One is the fear of failure. Yes, I want you to think about your FOMO and keep visualizing the positive, but even more powerful is think about those choices after the choice. To your point, plan more for the downside and just think through the things that could be wrong and know how you would act. If you plan more from the downside, I guarantee you can master that fear equation and you will actually move into action. And to your point, you have nothing but delight on the upside. This is why there's so much more power in thinking about how you would plan and confront these fears you have and understand all the available choices you have after them. That will get you into action, I think. And ironically, I would say to people, like, you can start as a realist and end up as an optimist by virtue of using this practice. The other is to be sort of a diehard optimist over the long term, but over the short term, just be totally frozen at the thought that any single thing in your plan might go wrong, which, by the way, is not particularly empowering.
You mentioned earlier the immigrant mindset. You talked about new immigrants to whatever country, often coming with nothing. And when you start with nothing, it's hard to go down.
It's all upside.
Yeah.
It's all upside. That's what I say to people. I would say to people, it's interesting, coming all the way back to where we started, the word risk talks about possibility, loss, and injury. Ironically, if you look at the definition of risk-taking in the dictionary, it actually talks about uncertain outcomes towards a goal. And it flips around the entire definition. And you're like, oh yeah, most risk-taking is actually for the upside. Let's not forget that. Most of the choices we make are to realize gain. And we keep letting ourselves be sort of overwhelmed by the thought of making one mighty choice. And I'm like, okay, once again, if you think that most risk taking is for the gain, you should plan more for the downside, and you can be surprised to the upside.
We didn't talk about it too much today, but the fear of missing out, the peer pressure, so to speak, I think if one stays down the path where you are hoping people go, that's a lot better for you than necessarily constantly trying to compare to the neighbors and the friends who might not have this same great understanding. So I think that's one of the tricks is we might know what you're talking about in Choose Possibility, but then people look at their neighbors, oh, look what he or she's doing, and then they get sidetracked.
I think what you're pointing to is we're all running our own race. You and I would agree that there's some healthy level of competition when we see what others are achieving and we think ourselves capable, and that galvanizes us into action. When we presume that we want others' rewards, we end up going down a different path. So I'm all for competition. I think what I find most troubling about watching the neighbors is we're trying to choose somebody else's reward set, whether or not it's what we really want. And so I think therein is the danger. So I'm all for competition, competitive mindset, if it gets you into action. But I think mostly it's about architecting what you want for yourself and measuring. And I think once you feel and understand that you have agency to make not one, but multiple choices, and you may or may not get the original reward you anticipated, but you will keep unlocking reward every time you choose. I think then you sort of end up running your own race entirely, and you start to forget to compare yourself to others. And to me, that is agency is at its most powerful when we don't look at others and think that they're so much better than us or capable. I think it's when we feel our own capacity fully.
I'll let you run, but everything we've talked about today, if one went ahead and quantified it and made it a trading system or the back office for a venture capital firm, you could code everything we've talked about today and make it work and find a positive mathematical expectation, in my humble opinion.
You could. That is entirely my thesis also. My thesis is that any single choice may fail, but if you were to calculate the odds over a lifetime of exercising risk as a muscle, you would find a pretty predictable correlation to cumulative success.
The book, Choose Possibility, Take Risks and Thrive, even when you fail. Of course, we're all going to fail, right? Cool stuff. Cool stuff. Hey, where would you like to direct people to? Is there a website or...
Yes. You can obviously purchase the book directly on any of your favorite sites. You can go to www.choosepossibility.com, take the risk quiz and learn a little bit about how you might be wired today and what you can do to become what I call a chooser.
Sukhinder, thank you for coming on today. Look, I've done a lot of these podcasts, coming up on 1,000. You easily, and I say this affectionately, you easily are one of the fastest talkers I've ever had.
Oh, no.
You are quick. I mean, I
I'm not sure that's good or bad, but
no,
let's hope your listeners don't mind.
I mean, look, if we did a transcript, I guarantee we're got a lot more pages here with me and you in an hour than the typical conversation. So.
Well, I was going to say it's been really fun, and I appreciate your taking the time. And hopefully, as I said, it's not overwhelming, but rather something helpful to everybody's listening.
Hey, when COVID finishes and you're ever in Vietnam again, please give me a shout. Coffee on me.
That sounds really good. I hope to be back there one day.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.